Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to sharpen up this shot here and also target specific tonal ranges so that you can limit the amount of sharpening in, say, the shadows and preserve the sharpening that you've done in the highlights. And that just helps you minimize sharpening and only sharpen the bits you need to see, and the less sharpening you need to do, the less artifacts you're likely to add. So let's start off by opening up shadows.cr2. It's a raw file, so once you've opened that in the raw editor, click Open Image at the bottom right to bring it into Photoshop's main editor, because we're going to use the Smart Sharpen tool. And you'll find that by going to Filter, Sharpen. You'll notice that some of these are greyed out, and that's because the image is at a high resolution. There's more bits per channel than some of these particular filters can deal with, but sharpening is fine. These are all accessible. And the one we're after is Smart Sharpen. Now, if you've looked at some of the other video tutorials on this disk, you'll notice that the interface here is exactly the same as the Elements Adjust Sharpness filter. So it's exactly the same, but if you've not watched that, I'll go through and show you what these settings do, just so that you're familiar with them. So kick off by magnifying the shot to 100%, because that's when you can see any artifacts that might be added when you start sharpening things up. And Amount increases the contrast around the edge of neighboring pixels, and by increasing contrast you create the illusion of sharpness. For example, watch the areas here in the shot, especially the highlights of the eye and the whiskers. If I whack Amount up to something really high like 238%, then you'll see it's sharpened it up a little bit. If I click to show the original, unclick to show you the sharpened version, you can see there's a difference there already. Now Radius allows you to spread out the amount of contrast by dragging the slider to the right. So watch what happens when I go too far. You're creating halos, which are basically lines around the edges of pixels, and that creates very dark black etched lines into the shot, and also it burns out some of the highlights. There's the before, there's the after. So we've lost a lot of detail and created some very over the top blown out highlights and very clipped black shadows, as well as nasty thick halos, especially around here. You can see a white halo around the edge there, so you can have white as well as black halos before and after. So that's deliberately showing you the problems that you might encounter by going over the top. So let's just take Amount down to something more sensible, maybe like 119 before and after. And at the moment we've got a very high radius, so let's just take that down a tad to maybe just around about 2.1. You don't want to go any higher than 2, otherwise you do get these horrible halos. You can see that around the edge there. It's worth going to change from Gaussian blur to lens blur. Watch the halo when I do this. It just takes the edge off some of those halos. So lens blur is much more sophisticated and better at revealing detail while still sharpening the shot. There's the before, there's the after, and even though I'm using a really stupidly high radius setting like 7.9 and spreading out the contrast from my pixels, it's still managing to deal with it fairly well. So I'm going to take radius down to something more sensible, like about 2.4 now. I can go a little bit higher now. I'm using lens blur, and there's the before and there's the after. So that's much more sharp now without or any horrible artifacts like halos and blown out highlights. Now more accurate just uses a longer amount of processing time and more number crunching. So if you click that, then you can see it's jumped up slightly and it's a little bit sharper, but I tend to find that exaggerates any noise or grain in the shot, so I don't tend to use it. Watch when I turn it off. It just gives it a little bit of a smoother look, so I don't tend to worry about that too much. And motion blur is if you've got a handheld camera on a full zoom, you might get a little bit of blur that way, so you can actually adjust the angle of the blur itself to try and compensate for it. Don't tend to find that works very well. It's much better to use a tripod in the first place than to try and fix it in post-production using this particular filter. So don't forget to set this back to lens blur to actually sharpen the image properly, and let's click on Advanced, and I'll show you how to target specific tonal ranges. Because say you wanted to keep the highlights sharp but you weren't too worried about the shadows, for example, you could go to Shadow, and then you could say, oh, let's just drag fade amount up. Now watch the shadows, they'll get softer, but the highlights are staying sharper. So there's before and after. Look at the shadows this time, before and after. So there's no real difference in the shadows, but the highlights are showing up nicely. If you want to increase some of the sharpness in the shadows, just drag tonal width to the left a little bit to allow the sharpening to affect some of the wider tones there. And of course radius, it does the same as it does in the main interface. It just widens the spread of the contrast change around each pixel. So that's a great way of targeting specific tones to sharpen up parts of the shot without sharpening the whole thing, and that's a great way of limiting the amount of artifacts like haloing and grain that you could add to the image as a whole by just targeting a specific tone.